At the courthouse, my son mocked me and sneered. That old man can't even afford a lawyer. Everyone stared at me, a 68-year-old man, alone with no one by my side. Then the judge spoke. He doesn't need a lawyer. The entire courtroom fell silent. My son's lawyer looked at the file, his face turning pale. The smile on my son's lips froze. I said nothing in my defense. I simply opened the first folder, and in that moment, everything he thought he controlled began to collapse. I'm truly grateful you're here with me. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments so we can connect. I read them all. Also, please note, parts of this story are slightly dramatized for storytelling and learning purposes. Any similarities are coincidental, but the message is meaningful. My son's laughter cut through the federal courtroom, like a blade through silence. He pointed at me standing alone at the defense table in my worn charcoal suit, and his voice boomed with theatrical contempt. That old man can't even afford a lawyer. 200 eyes turned toward me, a 68-year-old man sitting by himself. No briefcase, no legal team, no armor. The gallery murmured. The press leaned forward. My son's smile widened, savoring what he believed was my final humiliation. Then Judge Davies looked down at me, her silver hair catching the cold courtroom light. Mr. Garrison, do you have legal representation? I stood slowly, my joints protesting after years of building empires my son thought he could steal. I don't need one, Your Honor. The room went deathly silent. My son's lawyer, a man whose sharp suit couldn't hide the sudden pallor spreading across his face, flipped open the case file. His hands trembled. The pages rustled like dying leaves. His eyes darted across the documents, and I watched the exact moment the color drained from his skin. My son's smile froze. I didn't offer a defense. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened my leather portfolio and pulled out the first document, a single page that contained a name my son thought belonged to a faceless equity fund in New York. And in that moment, everything he believed he controlled began to collapse. You see, Pierce didn't realize that, in a courtroom, the loudest man is usually the most desperate. I maintained my composure, absorbing the humiliation like a sponge. I had spent years teaching him about the weight of a signature, the importance of a contract, and the sacred nature of a promise. But as I watched him play the role of the grieving but firm successor, I realized I had failed. I hadn't taught him the most important lesson of all, how to recognize a trap when the teeth were already touching his skin. Beside Pierce stood his lead counsel, a man who moved with the nervous energy of a shark sensing blood in the water. Behind me, the gallery was a sea of murmurs and camera shutters. I felt the heat of the press lights on the back of my neck. I looked up at the bench where Judge Davies, a man whose silver hair and deep-set eyes suggested he had seen every trick in the legal playbook, looked down with an expression that remained unreadable. The air in the room smelled of old paper and the expensive cologne Pierce used to mask his insecurity. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the metallic bitterness of betrayal. I didn't hate my son in that moment. I felt a profound, weary disappointment. He thought he was winning a war, but he was really just burning down the only house that would ever truly shelter him. The paper hit the desk. Thud. The sound of a lie becoming truth. Pierce's lawyer stepped forward, holding a heavy manila folder, as if it were a holy relic. If it pleases the court, we have the certified evidence, the lawyer stated. This is a full admission of guilt, signed by Thane Garrison on February 14th of this year. It details the systematic theft of $7.5 million in trade secrets and proprietary logistics algorithms. The courtroom went deathly silent. I watched the clerk take the document and hand it to the judge. Pierce turned his head toward me, mouthing the words, "Checkmate, Dad," with a vicious little glint in his eye. He genuinely believed that a single piece of paper was enough to erase 30 years of my life. The gallery erupted in a frantic tapping of phone screens as the reporters broadcast the news of my confession in real time. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I simply watched the way my son preened in the spotlight, savoring his supposed victory. He was so blinded by the glare of his own ego that he couldn't see the shadow I was casting over his entire future. Checkmate is a bold claim to make when you haven't even identified all the pieces on the board yet. I looked at the signature on the screen, a loopy, hesitant imitation of my own name, and felt the final chord of paternal mercy snap inside my heart. I stood up, and for a second the room felt smaller, like an arena where the lion had finally grown tired of the hyena's yapping. The bailiff started to move toward me, but Judge Davies raised a hand, stopping him. "Mr. Garrison," the judge said, his voice quiet, but echoing with an authority that made Pierce's earlier shouting feel thin. "You appear to be unrepresented by counsel. This is a federal proceeding of the highest gravity. Do you understand that without an attorney, you are at a catastrophic disadvantage? Do you understand the nature of the confession currently resting on my bench?" I adjusted my worn jacket, pulling the shoulders straight. I looked Judge Davies in the eye, and for the first time that morning, I let the flint in my gaze show. "I don't need a lawyer today, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the dementia Pierce had spent months whispering about to the board. "I'm not here to defend myself against these fabricated charges or to explain a signature I never wrote. I'm here in a very different capacity." Pierce's smile didn't just fade. It evaporated, replaced by a flicker of the same fear he'd felt as a child when I caught him in a lie. He leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the plaintiff's table. I looked past him, my focus shifting to the future I was about to dismantle. "I am here as the supreme creditor of this disgraced empire," I stated, the mystery of my status hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "And I am here to collect." To understand the cold precision of my silence in that courtroom, you have to understand the heat of the humiliation that fueled it 2 weeks earlier. My declaration to Pierce, "I am here to collect," wasn't just legal theater. It was the final note in a symphony of retribution that began on a night when the Lake Forest air felt like frozen needles. 14 days before the hearing, my rented sedan rattled as I drove toward the gilded gates of my son's $12 million estate. The engine groaned a weary sound that matched the charcoal suit I'd pulled from the back of my closet. I had purposefully chosen this humble camouflage, a disguise of perceived failure, because I wanted to see how deep the rot in my son's soul had traveled before I began the extraction. I rolled down the window as I approached the security kiosk. The guard, a man whose salary I had personally funded for a decade, barely looked at me. He saw a battered car and a man who looked like a retired accountant on a fixed income. He didn't see the architect. He didn't see the man who had laid the literal foundation of the very driveway he was standing on. I was only there because Arlo Garrison, my 28-year-old daughter, and a pediatric resident with my own resolute chin had begged me to attend. "Just one night, Dad." She had pleaded, her voice reflecting a deep worry Pierce didn't deserve. "For the cameras, for the sake of the family appearance." "I'm not here for the cameras, Arlo," I told her, as I parked the rental between a row of imported Italian sports cars. "I'm here because I still remember the son he used to be." Have you ever walked into a house you paid for and been treated like a trespasser? It is a peculiar sensation, one that strips away the warmth of memory and replaces it with the clinical cold of a strategic audit. As I stepped through the towering mahogany double doors, the scent of blooming jasmine from the gardens mixed with the heavy tang of luxury car exhaust. Inside the foyer was a grotesque monument to new money. Massive marble columns rose toward a ceiling, dripping with excessive chandeliers, and the air smelled of perfume that cost more than a month of a dock worker's wages. I stood in the center of the room, my modest suit making me invisible to the high society guests who swirled around me like colorful fish in a tank I had built. I watched Pierce holding court near the grand staircase, his laughter echoing with an unearned authority. He was surrounded by men in bespoke silk and women draped in high-end designers, all of them feeding off the crumbs of the empire I had constructed. To them, I was just a ghost in a polyester shroud. To me, they were all just liabilities waiting to be balanced. Gilded cages. That's all these mansions are, just cages with better lighting and more expensive locks. I saw Arlo move toward me through the crowd, her face a mask of relief. But before she could reach me, the predator of the household intercepted my path. Leonie Garrison, a 34-year-old art consultant draped in vintage Chanel, glided across the polished marble with a glass of vintage Cristal and a predatory gaze. She was the woman who had convinced Pierce that our family history was an anchor holding him back from greatness. She didn't greet me as a father-in-law. She looked at me like a stain on a pristine rug. She stumbled over absolutely nothing, a practiced theatrical motion that sent the entire glass of champagne splashing directly onto my chest. The surrounding elite gasped a collective sound of manufactured shock before the first few snickers began to ripple through the room. The cold vintage Cristal soaked instantly through my white shirt, the liquid clinging to my skin like ice. Leonie pressed a manicured hand to her chest, her expression one of mock horror. "Oh goodness, Thane, I am so incredibly clumsy," she announced, her voice carrying easily over the string quartet. "I completely forgot that you probably don't have a spare shirt in that little car of yours. Try not to drip on the marble. It was imported from Italy and costs more than your retirement fund. I didn't move. I didn't wipe the wine away. I stood there dripping and looked directly into her ice-cold eyes. "It's just wine, Leonie," I replied, my voice calm enough to make her smile falter, but the smell of desperation in this room that never washes out. The champagne felt like ice against my skin, but inside I was a furnace, a controlled fire that was finally ready to burn away the debris. Leonie leaned in close, then her breath smelling of grapes and cold ambition, and whispered a threat that made the wine on my chest feel like blood. "You should have stayed in the shadows, old man," she hissed, the mask of the polite hostess slipping. "Pierce is the future, and you're just a footnote we're about to delete." As she pulled away, her wrist caught the light, and I noticed the specific high-end watch she was wearing. I didn't need a magnifying glass to recognize the unique bezel. It matched a serial number from a missing corporate asset list I had flagged months ago. It was a $20,000 piece of stolen evidence sitting right there on her arm. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. They were so confident in my decline that they weren't even trying to hide their thefts. Arlo reached my side, then her hand trembling as she grabbed my arm, her eyes full of a shame that belonged to her brother. I patted her hand, a silent signal that I was still the one in control. The silence in the foyer didn't last long, because Pierce never could resist an entrance when he thought he held the winning hand. The heavy doors of his private study swung open, and my son stepped out holding a manila folder with the same arrogant grip he would use in that courtroom. He looked at my soaked shirt and let out a bark of laughter that signaled the end of the party and the beginning of the war. Pierce was about to drop a legal bomb that would turn this celebration into a crime scene, and I was exactly where I needed to be to watch him pull the pin. The manila folder hit my chest with the weight of a lead brick bursting open to rain white legal lies across the wet marble floor. Pierce didn't just step out of his study. He strode into the foyer like a conqueror returning from a scorched earth campaign, his hand gripping a glass of amber scotch that trembled slightly with his unearned adrenaline. He looked at me, then at the champagne soaking my shirt, and he let out a jagged bark of laughter that silenced the quartet in the corner. The elite of Chicago's social circle men I had enriched and women I had hosted for decades froze mid-sip, their eyes darting between the disgraced father and the rising son. "You're a parasite, Dad," Pierce announced, his voice carrying the rehearsed resonance of a man who had spent too much time in front of a mirror. "You've been feeding off the lifeblood of Garrison Logistics for 30 years, and I'm the one who finally caught you selling the blueprints." I looked down at the papers scattered at my feet. I didn't need to read them to know they were a masterpiece of fiction. He was publicly accusing me of industrial espionage, claiming I had sold proprietary logistics algorithms to our primary competitor. "Consider this your early retirement gift," he sneered, tossing the empty folder aside. "You'll be spending what's left of your miserable life in a federal courtroom trying to explain why you sabotaged your own legacy for a payday you didn't even need. 30 years of building, 5 seconds of burning. That's all it takes." I watched the scotch swirl in his glass, noticing the way his eyes avoided mine. He was overcompensating, projecting a strength he hadn't yet earned by trying to hollow out the man who had given him everything. I didn't defend myself. I didn't shout. I simply stood there dripping with vintage Cristal and felt the final threads of my paternal patience dissolve into a cold, clinical resolve. The shock in the room was palpable, a heavy blanket of judgment that I wrapped around myself like armor. Pierce wasn't just suing me. He was performing a public execution. He wanted the world to see the great Thane Garrison as a desperate aging thief, so that no one would question the sudden shift in power. He was banking on my silence, on my desire to protect the family name, but he had forgotten that I was the one who taught him that a name is only worth the integrity behind it. I saw Arlo move toward me, her face a mask of horror, but Pierce's security team stepped into her path. This was a choreographed severance, a surgical removal of the old guard designed to leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a mountain of legal debt. Pierce took a long, slow sip of his scotch, his smile widening as he saw me remain silent. He thought my lack of a rebuttal was a sign of defeat. "Check your phone, old man," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still reached every ear in the foyer. "Those joint accounts, the ones you used to fund your little retirement lifestyle, they're under emergency corporate suspicion now. They're mine. Everything in this family is mine." I didn't need to look at my phone to know he was telling the truth. He had used the board's fear of a scandal to freeze my personal assets, effectively cutting off my oxygen. Then came the mid-twist, the real reason for this theater. "I didn't just do this for the money, Dad. By filing this suit, I've triggered the moral turpitude clause in the bylaws. Your voting rights are suspended until the verdict. I'm finalizing the pension fund transfer tomorrow morning, and you won't be there to cast a single vote against me." My son's smile was a polished gravestone for a father who wasn't even dead yet. He had orchestrated a legal coup to bypass the last line of defense for the 800 families who worked for us. Security Pierce barked, snapping his fingers. "Show this trespasser the door." I was physically escorted across the marble I had selected, past the imported sculptures I had gifted him, and pushed out through the massive mahogany doors into the biting lake forest night. A blizzard was beginning to swirl the air, filled with the sharp scent of ozone and the promise of a heavy freeze. I heard the rhythmic mechanical drone of a winch and looked up to see my modest rental car being hoisted onto a tow truck. Pierce followed me out onto the portico, the wind whipping his hair into a frenzy. He looked at me standing there in my wine-stained shirt, shivering as the snowflakes began to sting my exposed skin. He pulled his wallet from his pocket and extracted $200 bills. He let them go, watching as they flitted through the air like dying birds before landing in the freezing slush at my feet. "Here's a tip for the bus ride." He laughed, his voice competing with the howling wind. "Don't spend it all in one place. Walk fast, Dad. Hypothermia doesn't care about your legacy." If you ever find yourself standing in the snow, disowned by your own blood, you learn one thing. Ice doesn't hurt nearly as much as the truth of a betrayal. I looked down at the $200 bills sinking into the mud. The ink was slightly blurred by the moisture, but the serial numbers were crisp and clear. My mind trained for decades to track the movement of millions locked onto the sequence. I recognized that stack. They were part of a specific sequential shipment of cash I had been tracking for 6 months. The same cash used for a secret offshore bribe that had been bleeding the company's auxiliary accounts. Pierce hadn't just disowned me, he had handed me the smoking gun. He was too arrogant to realize that he had just given his hunter the scent. I stood in the swirling white void, the freezing wind whipping the wine-stained shirt against my skin, looking down at the bills in the mud, and for the first time in 6 months, I stopped feeling like a father and started feeling like a hunter. I was no longer the aging founder watching his empire slip away. I was the architect. And I was about to show my son exactly what happens when you try to demolish a building while the designer is still holding the blueprints. The wet pavement of Lake Forest didn't care about my 30 years of sweat and legacy. It only cared about soaking through my shoes as I walked away from the house I had paid for in cash. The walk down the mile-long driveway felt like a pilgrimage through the underworld, each step a heavy reminder of the betrayal I had just endured. I stood in the swirling white void only moments ago, the freezing wind whipping the wine-stained shirt against my skin, looking down at the bills in the mud. For the first time in 6 months, I stopped feeling like a father and started feeling like a hunter. The transition was visceral, a shedding of the soft, grieving skin I had worn since my wife passed away. My shoes crunched against the frozen slush, a rhythmic sound that masked the distant mechanical drone of the tow truck hauling away the last vestige of the life Pierce thought he had stolen from me. I passed the security gate where the guards stood at attention. These were men whose salaries I had signed off on for a decade, men who had once greeted me with genuine respect. Now they looked away in awkward silence, their eyes fixed on the falling snow. One of them, a man I had helped with his mortgage 5 years ago, stepped forward. "I didn't think you'd have to walk, Mr. Garrison," he whispered, his breath hitching in the cold. I adjusted the collar of my coat, feeling the stiff, icy cage of my champagne-soaked shirt underneath. "I'm not walking, Leo," I replied, my voice as steady as the winter wind. "I'm just gaining a head start. You see, Protocol Icarus wasn't a reaction to the events of tonight. I have lived long enough to know that pride doesn't just go before a fall. It builds the cliff. For years, I had been funneling my true wealth, the real bedrock of my acquisitions, into a ghost entity called Vanguard Holdings. It was a safety net I had woven in secret, a silent insurance policy in case Pierce proved to be the failure I always feared he might become. I had hoped I would never have to touch it. I had hoped he would grow into the responsibility, but tonight he had proven that he wasn't just incompetent, he was predatory. As I reached the dark, unlit suburban road, the isolation should have felt crushing. Instead, it felt like oxygen. The cold Chicago air had a metallic smell, sharp and clean, cutting through the cloying scent of the luxury perfumes and expensive scotches that had filled that mansion. I was finally alone, and for the first time in a year, I knew exactly what my next move was. Do you know what the hardest part of being a father is? Realizing when your creation has become a monster. It is a slow realization, a series of small betrayals that you excuse as youthful arrogance until they coalesce into something lethal. I reached a lone bus stop, its flickering fluorescent light casting long skeletal shadows across the snow-covered bench. I stepped under the overhang and reached into a waterproof inner pocket of my coat. I didn't pull out the cheap smartphone Pierce had frozen and tracked. I pulled out a military-grade satellite phone. It was heavy as solid weight in my numb hand that felt more real than anything in that house. I entered a 12-digit encrypted code, the buttons clicking with a precision that soothed my frayed nerves. The screen glowed blue, a digital heartbeat in a dead night. It was connecting to a secure server in Manhattan that hadn't been touched in 6 months, waking up a leviathan that had been sleeping in the dark. The static hiss of an encrypted satellite connection filled my ear, a beautiful chaotic noise. Identity confirmed, a synthesized voice whispered. Protocol Icarus, awaiting authentication. I stared out at the dark road, watching the snowflakes dance in the yellow beam of the street lamp. This is the architect, I said, my voice barely more than a breath. Authorize override. We're going live. The response was instantaneous. A series of rapid beeps signaled the activation of a dozen offshore protocols. The trap was finally set. I wasn't just making a phone call. I was signing a death warrant for the world Pierce thought he owned. The phone rang once before a voice answered, gruff and steady. Nathan Brooks, a 62-year-old with the rough hands of a former dock foreman and the sharp suit of a COO, had a voice that sounded like gravel grinding over silk. Nathan had been my shadow for 30 years, the only man who knew where all the bodies and the bank accounts were buried. I've been waiting for this call for 18 months, Thane Nathan said, skipping any pretense of a greeting. He's already bled the pension fund dry. He thinks the IPO will cover the tracks, but he's underwater by 50 million. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the cold metal of the bus stop. The betrayal was deeper than I had imagined. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had stolen from the men who had spent their lives building our legacy. My resolve, already cold, turned into something absolute. Don't just stop the bleeding, Nathan. I said, the words coming out with a reflective weight. I want to own the knife. Activate Protocol Icarus. Begin the total financial quarantine of the Garrison name. I want every credit line frozen and every asset called. Nathan let out a short, sharp breath. That's the nuclear option, Thane. It'll destroy the company. I stood up, stepping out from under the shelter, as a gust of wind sent a flurry of snow into my face. The company is already dead, Nathan. Pierce is just playing with the corpse. It's time to perform the autopsy. Nathan paused, and I could hear the tapping of a keyboard on his end. I've already intercepted the secret offshore wire transfer he tried to authorize an hour ago. It's the same sequential bills you saw in the snow. He's sloppy, Thane. He didn't even use a burner. Nathan's voice dropped to a whisper that was colder than the Chicago wind. Thane, you need to see what he's been doing with the 800 series accounts. It's not just embezzlement, it's a slaughter. The G55, cut through the night like a silver needle. But the air inside the cabin was thicker than the storm I'd left behind in Chicago. I leaned back into the buttery leather of the captain's chair, watching the dark expanse of the Midwest blur beneath us. Only hours ago, I had been standing in the freezing slush of my own driveway, discarded by a son who thought he had finally buried me. Nathan's voice had dropped to a whisper that was colder than the Chicago wind. Thane, you need to see what he's been doing with the 800 series accounts. It's not just embezzlement, it's a slaughter. Yes, those words rang in the back of my mind, a rhythmic thrum that matched the hum of the jet engines vibrating through the floor. I looked down at my hands, still carrying the faint residue of the champagne Leonie had spilled on me. I felt a cold, surgical focus settle over me. The Teterboro hangar was waiting, but my mind was already buried in the digital ledgers Nathan was transmitting to my secure tablet. I was no longer the man in the wine-stained shirt. I was the architect returning to the fortress I had built in the shadows. The flight crew and the security detail moved around me with a practiced efficiency. I noticed the subtle glances they threw my way, a mixture of relief and professional curiosity. They haven't seen me in 6 months. To the world, and more importantly to Pierce, I had been in a state of rapid cognitive decline, a faked retirement designed specifically to bait my son into a sense of total unchecked control. I had needed to see who he truly was when he thought I wasn't looking, and he had shown me a monster. Welcome back, mister, Chairman, the flight attendant said, as she placed a glass of aged scotch on the side table. I haven't been back in 6 months, I replied, my voice dry and resonant. Does the office still smell like cedar and ambition? She offered a small, knowing smile. It smells exactly as you left it, sir. I unbuttoned my wet shirt, tossing it into the disposal bin. I reached into the onboard wardrobe and pulled out a crisp, bespoke suit. As I slid into the silk lining, the transformation felt complete. Luxury is just armor for the rich. Tonight I was putting my armor back on. We touched down at Teterboro, under a shroud of late-night mist. A black SUV was waiting on the tarmac, its engine idling with a low, predatory growl. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. The drive into Manhattan was a blur of neon lights and steel, the skyline rising up to meet me like an old friend who knew all my secrets. We pulled up to the glass tower that housed Vanguard HQ, a fortress overlooking the Hudson that Pierce didn't even know I still controlled. I stepped into the private elevator, the ascent so smooth it was almost imperceptible. When the door slid open, the smell of cedar and expensive stationery hit me a familiar scent that grounded me in my power. Nathan Brooks was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his silhouette framed by the grid of golden lights that made up the Manhattan skyline. He turned as I entered, his eyes scanning me with the clinical precision of a man who had spent 30 years at my right hand. "You look better in charcoal than you did in that polyester thane," he said, his voice a gravelly comfort. I walked toward the central glass conference table, my heels clicking sharply on the polished stone. "Polyester has its uses," Nathan, I replied. "It reminds you how much people judge the skin rather than the heart. Have you ever held a piece of paper that could turn a man into a ghost?" Nathan didn't answer. He simply tapped a command on his tablet, and the massive monitors lining the room flared to life with the blue-tinted light of the Vanguard servers. We sat in the nerve center where I had dismantled empires, but tonight the target was my own family legacy. Nathan pulled up the hidden ledger for Garrison Logistics, the one Pierce thought was buried behind firewalls. I watched the numbers scroll past, a dizzying array of debt and desperation. Pierce had been bleeding the company to fund an IPO that was nothing more than a house of cards. He was desperate for capital, Nathan explained, pointing to a series of high-interest loans. He borrowed $125 million from a faceless equity firm called Silverback Acquisitions. He thinks he's playing with some shark from Dubai he met at a gallery opening. I leaned forward, the cold, smooth touch of the glass conference table pressing against my palms. "Silverback," I whispered. "He's playing with the man who taught him how to read a balance sheet. He just forgot I wrote the rules." Silverback Acquisitions was a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard. My son had unknowingly mortgaged the family company to his own father. Pierce was a fisherman who thought he'd caught a whale. He didn't realize the whale was the one dragging him into the depths. I watched as Nathan pulled up the physical loan documents, the scans revealing every stroke of my son's pen. "He signed the papers yesterday," Nathan said, his voice devoid of pity. He was so sure of himself, he didn't even have a second set of eyes look at the fine print. I stared at the signature on the $125 million note, my son's loopy, arrogant cursive. It was a testament to his hubris, a digital record of the moment he sold his soul for a throne he didn't know was already hollow. But then my eyes caught something at the bottom of the page. My heart, usually a steady, icy engine, skipped a beat. Pierce hadn't just used the company as collateral. I saw the legal description of the primary asset used to guarantee the loan. He had put up the family's historic Lake Forest estate, my home, the house where I had raised him, the house where his mother had died. He had gambled my very memories to pay for his pride. I stared at that signature, my breath hitching in my chest, and then I noticed something else. A secondary signature. One that made the blood in my veins turn to liquid nitrogen. The name on the line was Arlo's, but the ink wasn't hers. The name at the bottom of the $125 million debt note was Arlo's, but the curve of the A was wrong. It was a clumsy imitation, written by a hand that had never known a day of honest work. I stared at the signature on the Vanguard monitor, my eyes narrowing as I processed the depth of the depravity. The suggestion that my daughter, a woman who spent her nights in a pediatric ward saving lives, would ever co-sign my son's reckless gambling was an insult to her character. It was more than just a forgery. It was a tactical human shield. Pierce hadn't just borrowed money. He had attempted to implicate his own sister as a co-guarantor, ensuring that if he went down, he would drag her into the abyss with him. I felt a surge of protective fury that was colder than the Manhattan winter outside. Nathan Brooks leaned in, tapping a key that overlaid Arlo's verified medical license signature with the one on the debt note. The software flashed red across the entire screen. "The pressure points are off." Nathan noted, his voice a gravelly monotone. The ink was barely dry when this was scanned. "And look at the notary stamp." I followed his finger to the seal. It was verified by a crony in Pierce's inner circle, the same man Pierce had recommended to me as a trustworthy financial advisor months ago. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a predatory criminal act. He's using her. Nathan, I whispered, the realization shifting my perspective. He burned the bridge behind him, and now he's trying to use his sister as the fuel. He didn't just steal money, he stole time, decades of it. I turned my attention away from the forgery and toward the 800 series accounts. These were the protected retirement funds, the literal futures of the dock workers and drivers who had been the muscle of Garrison Logistics since the day I bought my first truck. Nathan dived into the shadow ledgers Maria Gonzalez had flagged before her termination. The reality was a digital massacre. We watched as a series of convoluted wire transfers moved in rhythmic, sickening pulses from the pension fund to a shell company called Techmar Solutions. The total was staggering $68 million. Pierce had siphoned the bedrock of the company to cover his personal trading losses and Leonie's boutique art gallery lifestyle. Look at the ledger, I said, pointing to a massive outflow dated just 3 days after my wife's funeral. He didn't even wait for the dirt to settle. He didn't just take the surplus, he took the security. Those men worked 30 years for those pensions, and my son spent it in 18 months on Italian leather and offshore bets. The ledger was a battlefield, and my son had been shooting at his own medics. I felt a profound heartbreak for the families I had promised to protect, a weight that far outweighed my own personal loss. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vanguard penthouse, looking out over the Manhattan skyline. The lights of the city twinkled like a sea of diamonds, but all I could see were the faces of the 800 families Pierce had betrayed. Simply taking my company back wasn't enough. A corporate takeover would leave the debts on the books and the workers in the cold. I realized then that I was the only one who could truly save them. The architect had built the structure, but the liquidator would have to perform the surgery. Nathan, I said, without turning around, I want the liquidator strike team ready by dawn. We aren't just performing a corporate raid. We're performing a public service. I want total surgical removal of every bit of rot Pierce has introduced. We are going to guarantee every single dollar of those workers' losses personally through Vanguard. This stopped being about a son who didn't love his father the moment he touched those pensions. We are going to own the knife, and we are going to use it to cut out the cancer before it kills the whole body. I felt a righteous resolve settle into my bones, a clarity that removed any lingering hesitation. If you think revenge is a dish best served cold, you're wrong. It's best served with a legal warrant and a zero-balance bank statement. I turned away from the window, the Manhattan lights reflected in my eyes like a fire I was ready to unleash. The plan was already forming in the back of my mind, a complex architecture of deception and justice. Nathan, call Chicago. I ordered, my voice regaining the resonant authority of my peak years. We need a specific type of office space, something in a dilapidated strip mall on the edge of the industrial district, somewhere Pierce would expect to find a broken, desperate version of his father. We're going to build a trap so small and so convincing that he won't even see the walls closing in until he hits them. I want him to find exactly what he thinks he's looking for, a man in cognitive decline, hiding the last of his stolen secrets. I watched Nathan's hands fly across the keyboard, initiating the first phase of Protocol Icarus. The trap was being set. We were going to give Pierce the illusion of total victory right up until the moment I pulled the floor out from under his feet. I looked one last time at the forged signature on the screen, the clumsy curve of the A that had sealed my son's fate. He thought he was playing a game of checkers, but I had already won the tournament before he even sat down at the table. The Teterboro hangar was waiting, and by tomorrow morning, the architect would be back in Chicago, setting the stage for a war that only one of us was equipped to survive. The strip mall on the industrial edge of Chicago smelled of stale grease and long-forgotten dreams, the perfect location for a man the world thought was dying to start a war. I stood in the middle of a dingy office space, the air thick with the sour scent of industrial cleaning fluid that failed to mask the rot in the drywall. My return to Chicago had been a ghost transit, silent and unnoticed. I had turned away from the Manhattan lights, ready to unleash a fire that Pierce never saw coming. This space was the first match. It was a far cry from the glass penthouse at Vanguard, but for the architect, it was exactly the right geometry. I had spent decades designing systems of global efficiency. Now, I was designing a theater of failure. I looked at the peeling wallpaper in the dark corner and felt a strange sense of comfort. Pierce had cast me out into the snow, assuming I would wither away. He didn't understand that I am a creature of the foundation, and the foundation is always built in the dark, gritty places where no one thinks to look. I had spent 48 hours populating this room with the specific bait I knew my son could not resist. I had placed mismatched metal cabinets against the walls and set up a flickering buzz from a neon sign in the window that signaled my supposed desperation. I carefully arranged the bait on a desk that had more coffee rings than surface area. I populated the space with outdated computers, their humming fans sounding like a death rattle. I scattered fake tax ledgers for non-existent bakeries and spreadsheets that appeared to show me desperately trying to hide small amounts of money, pathetic amateurish attempts to salvage a life. It is amazing how much effort it takes to look this incompetent. I wanted Pierce to find this place and feel a surge of that toxic superiority that had blinded him for years. The entry twist lay hidden in the digital bones of the room. The distressed files on the desk were the crown jewels of the deception. I had embedded encrypted trackers into the metadata of every digital drive. Anyone who plugs a USB into those drives, anyone who tries to steal my secrets, will unknowingly give Vanguard total access to their personal devices. I was building a mirror that would eventually show Pierce exactly what he had become while I watched from the safety of the glass. The linoleum floor was peeling back like a scab on a city that didn't know it was infected. I sat in a squeaky office chair that groaned under my weight, the only sound in the room, besides the hum of an old refrigerator. I pulled a tablet from my coat, its cold glass a stark contrast to the gritty surroundings. Through a secure live feed provided by Nathan, I watched the world I had left behind. Pierce was already moving. He was authorizing an aggressive media campaign to distance Garrison Logistics from its founder. I watched the metrics of the board's fear rising in real time. He believed he was purging a liability, unaware that he was actually severing his own safety net. As he cut me out of the corporate narrative, Vanguard was quietly acquiring more of his personal liabilities. "He's actually doing it," Thane Nathan's voice crackled through the encrypted line. "He's telling the board, you're a ghost." I leaned back, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling. "Good," I replied. "Let the ghost haunt the machine he built." Have you ever watched someone try to bury you while you're still holding the shovel? It is a peculiar kind of entertainment, watching the arrogance of a man who believes he has already won. I waited my strategic patience as cold as the ice on the sidewalk outside. I spent the afternoon monitoring the fallout of Pierce's decisions, watching the stock price of Garrison Logistics flutter like a wounded bird. Every word of his press releases was a lie I intended to use as a brick in his prison wall. I didn't feel rage. I felt the clinical detach of a surgeon preparing for an extraction. Pierce thought he was a king, but he was just a child playing with matches in a room I had soaked with gasoline. I sat in the shadows of the office monitoring his every move. He was too predictable, too hungry for the spotlight to see the darkness gathering at the edges of his stage. Then the main event began. Pierce held an emergency press conference at the Garrison Logistics HQ, standing before a sea of cameras. I watched it remotely from my sanctuary. He wore a mask of performative grief, his voice dripping with false concern. "My father is a pioneer," he told the world, "but his mind has become a labyrinth he can no longer navigate. We must protect the workers from the erratic decisions of a man who no longer knows where he is." He spoke of my rapid cognitive decline and my unfortunate financial delusions. He explicitly called me unfit for duty for the public record. I recorded every second with grim satisfaction. He was handing me the exact legal evidence I needed for a felony elder abuse countersuit. "Smile for the cameras, Pierce. Every tooth is a tally I'm keeping." I watched the screen intently as he gestured to emphasize a point about transparency. As the camera zoomed in, my heart skipped a beat, but not from fear. I noticed the glint of gold at his wrists. Pierce was wearing my late mother's heirloom cufflinks, heavy, intricately carved pieces that I had cherished. He had told me 3 years ago that he had lost them during a move. He had looked me in the eye and lied about a piece of his mother's soul. Seeing them now worn as trophies of his triumph solidified the ice in my veins. I leaned back into the squeaky office chair, watching my son's face on the monitor as he lied to the world, and for the first time, I didn't see my son at all. I saw a debt that was past due. The sirens didn't start until Saturday morning, but I had heard them coming for days. I was ready. The trap was set, and the bait was exactly where it needed to be to bring the predator home. The morning silence of the strip mall was shattered not by a storm, but by the aggressive screech of high-performance tires and the boots of men who thought they were soldiers of fortune. I sat in my Manhattan penthouse watching the high-definition feed play out on a wall of silent monitors. My hands wrapped around a porcelain mug didn't tremble. I had heard the sirens of their arrival in my mind for days, a rhythmic prophecy of the moment the predator would finally step into the light. On the screen, black SUVs swerved into the parking lot, kicking up plumes of gray slush. Pierce and Leonie stepped out with the synchronized arrogance of royalty visiting a slum flanked by a security detail in tactical gear. I watched as Pierce personally kicked open the flimsy glass door of my decoy office. He stepped over the shards, his chest puffed out with a victory he hadn't yet earned. I had purposefully left the Vanguard labeled boxes in plain sight because I knew Pierce wouldn't be able to resist a trophy he didn't have to work for. To him, this was the end of his father. To me, it was the opening note of his requiem. Pierce stood in the center of the wreckage, his custom Italian loafers crunching on the glass. He looked around the room, mocking the smell of failure, the lingering scent of industrial cleaning fluid and stagnant air. Leonie followed him in, using a designer handkerchief to shield her nose from the dust. "Look at this rat hole," Pierce shouted, his voice booming through the feed. "To think I actually feared the man who sits in this filth." Leonie snickered her heels, clicking sharply on the peeling floor. "Careful, Pierce," she warned, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Don't touch anything without gloves. Poverty is contagious." They began tearing the place apart, flipping the metal cabinets and sweeping my bait spreadsheets onto the floor. I watched them with clinical detachment. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a way to justify the betrayal they had already committed. Crunch. That was the sound of my past being stepped on by a custom-made Italian loafer, but I didn't flinch. I just waited for them to find the prize. Do you know why the devil is so successful? Because he always gives you exactly what you think you want. Pierce finally reached the stack of cardboard boxes I had strategically placed near the back of the room. I watched his face through the hidden lens as he read the words, "Vanguard Private Ledger," written in my own steady hand. His expression shifted from manic energy to pure radiant ecstasy. He reached in, pulling out a heavy black hard drive and a collection of flash drives. He held them up like a man who had discovered the Grail. "I have it." He breathed, the sound of his triumph vibrating in my headset. "I actually have the ledgers. He was too old to even hide them properly." "He's lost his edge, Leonie." Leonie laughed, a sharp, cold sound as she swept a cheap ceramic mug off the desk, watching it shatter into 100 white teeth on the floor. "This is his coffin, Pierce," she said, her eyes gleaming, "and we're the ones driving the nails. I want to see his face when the marshals show him these files. If you're still here, comment "still watching," so I know you're with me. And if it were you standing in that courtroom betrayed by your own blood, would you stay silent and wait, or strike back in that moment? A quick note: upcoming scenes include dramatized elements for storytelling. If it's not for you, feel free to stop here right now today. Pierce began barking orders to his security team, the bright clinical flash of their tactical lights dancing across the peeling wallpaper like searchlights in a prison yard. He held that dummy hard drive like a king holding a scepter, a cold metallic weight that he believed was the key to his absolute sovereignty. Load it all, he commanded. Every tower, every drive, every scrap of paper. By Monday morning, Thane Garrison won't even be a memory in this city. He'll be a cautionary tale told to freshman business students. He paced the small room, his adrenaline manifesting as a frantic, jerky energy. He didn't notice the tiny pin-sized lenses embedded in the smoke detectors, or the way the outdated desktop towers hummed with a frequency that wasn't cooling fans but high-gain transmitters. Every device he just seized was already broadcasting his GPS coordinates and every word of his frantic plotting directly to my Manhattan servers. He thought he was looting a treasury. He was really just strapping a tracking collar to his own neck. The taste of copper and adrenaline was thick in my mouth as I watched him celebrate his own demise. He was holding a grenade and calling it a diamond. I just had to wait for the pin to drop. Leonie moved toward the desk, her movements fluid and predatory. She pulled open the bottom drawer, searching for any more treasures to plunder. She found a small silver-framed photograph of my late wife Elena tucked away in the back. I felt a sudden sharp pang of grief as she held it up to the light, her lip curling in a mocking sneer. "Look at this," she said, tossing the frame casually into the trash can filled with broken glass and coffee grounds, still clinging to the dead. It's pathetic, really. Pierce didn't even look up. He was too busy admiring the digital trophies in his hands. I watched that frame land face down in the filth, and the last shred of paternal restraint I possessed snapped. I marked her in that moment for a ruin that would be far more personal than a simple loss of wealth. Pierce walked toward the door, holding the dummy hard drive high for his team to see, oblivious to the fact that he'd just handed me the shovel for his own grave. He stepped out into the morning air, his face tilted toward the gray Chicago sky, as if he expected the clouds to part for him. While Pierce was busy playing detective in the ruins of my bait, Arlo was preparing to deliver the final killing blow. Arlo didn't knock. She simply glided into Pierce's glass-walled office with the quiet authority of a surgeon about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. I watched through the hidden camera embedded in the ceiling, fan my perspective as cold as the lens itself. From my penthouse in Manhattan, I saw my son look up, his face still flushed with the adrenaline of the morning's raid. He looked at Arlo, then at the thick leather folder she carried, and his expression softened into condescending affection. Arlo had always been his favorite target because he mistook her empathy for weakness. She took a seat across from him, the scent of her subtle floral perfume mixing with the expensive wood polish of the executive desk. "I'm tired of the war, Pierce," she said, her voice practiced. "I've spoken to Dad. He's broken. He's ready to sign over the emergency trust just to have enough for a quiet facility in Florida." Pierce leaned back, a predatory grin spreading across his face. "He's finally seen sense," he replied, his voice dripping with unearned triumph. "He's become a ghost, haunting his own halls." Arlo didn't blink. She opened the folder, revealing a stack of legal documents I had spent years meticulously drafting. She wasn't actually on medical leave for exhaustion. She had been my eyes and ears inside the company for 6 months, an undercover investigator disguised as a grieving daughter. Greed is a blindfold, and Pierce was wearing it tight. He looked at the summary page, his eyes locking onto the figure, $2.3 million in immediate liquidity. To a man who had just bled $68 million from a pension fund, it shouldn't have been enough, but Pierce was drowning in offshore debts. He needed a win to show the board before the IPO. He buzzed his intercom, summoning the Garrison family lawyer, a man with a sharp nose for litigation and a duller one for ethics. The lawyer entered, adjusting his spectacles as he sat beside Arlo. He looked at the documents with the weary eyes of a man who had spent the morning processing the seized files from the strip mall. He saw the Vanguard seal, but he saw it in the context of a father's desperate peace offering. Arlo kept the conversation focused on the immediate injection of cash guiding their attention like a magician performing sleight of hand. "It looks like a standard inter-family liquidity transfer, sir," the lawyer muttered after a cursory glance at the boilerplate text. "The terms are favorable to the interim CEO." Pierce laughed, a sharp sound that vibrated through the microphones. "Good," he said, reaching for his fountain pen. "My father's guilt is finally paying dividends. I'll make sure his Florida facility has a view of the ocean. Have you ever seen a man sign his own death warrant while smiling for a selfie? It is a spectacle of pure hubris." Pierce unscrewed the cap of his pen with an aggressive flourish, the nib gleaming under the office lights. He flipped through the pages, skipping the technical addendums and the dense citations at the back of the folder. He was so blinded by the promise of $2.3 million that he didn't even pause at Section 12C. He didn't see the cross-collateralization clause that linked this minor trust transfer to the entirety of his personal holdings. He didn't see the provision that legally acknowledged Vanguard Holdings as his primary creditor, granting me the right to immediate asset seizure upon any change in trust status. With a final arrogant stroke of his pen, the trap I had built 3 years ago finally snapped shut. He handed the papers back to Arlo, his posture radiating godlike confidence. "There. It's done," he announced. "Tell the old man I'll send him a postcard from the Billionaires Club once the IPO goes live." Arlo took the folder, her fingers grazing the edge of the parchment as she stood up. "I'll be sure to give him the message, Pierce," she replied, her voice dropping to a register that was eerily similar to my own. Every single word of it. The ink on that page wasn't just liquid. It was the blood of the empire he thought he'd stolen. As Arlo turned toward the door, I watched Pierce's phone buzz on the desk. He reached for it, expecting a notification of the deposit, but the color drained from his face as he read the screen. It wasn't a bank alert. It was a notification from his primary offshore account, flagging a security audit that had effectively locked him out of his funds. He tapped the screen frantically, his thumbs leaving greasy smudges on the glass. "What is this?" he stammered, the first flicker of genuine panic appearing in his eyes. Arlo didn't stop. She didn't look back. She simply walked out of the glass office, the thunk of the closing door, sounding like the fall of a gavel. The lawyer looked up, finally noticing the shift in the room's atmosphere, but it was already too late. Section 12, C had already been transmitted to the Central Clearinghouse in New York, and the financial quarantine was beginning to spread through Pierce's world like a digital virus. Every asset he had leveraged, every loan he had secured with his stolen capital, was now legally under my control. I watched him through the monitor as he stood up, kicking his chair back so hard it hit the floor-to-ceiling windows. He began shouting into his phone, his voice a high-pitched rasp of desperation that reached all the way to my penthouse. He thought he was the architect of a new era, but he was really just a tenant whose lease had just expired. Arlo stepped into the elevator, her reflection in the polished steel doors, showing a woman who had finally reclaimed her family's honor. The countdown to total insolvency didn't start with a bang. It started with a quiet signature and a sister who was tired of being underestimated. Pierce leaned back in his leather chair, his feet once again on the desk, in a pathetic attempt to maintain the illusion of control, completely unaware that he had just handed Arlo the keys to his prison cell. The air in the boardroom felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen itself was being liquidated to pay off his sins. The financial freeze was about to hit Leonie in the most public way possible, and I was going to enjoy watching the frost crawl up their ivory tower. The silent execution of Pierce's empire didn't start with a gavel or a gunshot. It started with a soft, rhythmic beep of a credit card terminal in a store that smelled of expensive leather and unearned pride. I watched the live telemetry from my command center in Manhattan, sipping a tea that had finally stopped tasting like betrayal. 24 hours had passed since Arlo walked out of Pierce's office with his signature on the Section 12C agreement. I had timed the activation of the freeze with surgical precision. Saturday morning. The world's financial hubs were winding down for the weekend, and the personal bankers who usually smoothed over the indiscretions of the elite were currently on golf courses. I wanted Pierce and Leonie to feel the walls closing in when there was no one left to answer the phone. I sat back watching the first red flag blossom on the monitor as Leonie Garrison entered a high-end boutique in Chicago, intent on celebrating a victory that had already turned to ash. Leonie glided through the store, her eyes fixed on a limited edition $15,000 timepiece. She held her head high, the air of a dynasty she thought she had successfully usurped. I watched through a tapped security feed as she handed over her primary black card with a flourish of practiced entitlement. The sales associate swiped the card. Beep. The sound was sharp, cutting through the hushed atmosphere. Declined. Leonie's smile didn't falter, not yet. She reached into her designer clutch and produced a backup platinum card. Beep! The associate's expression shifted from professional deference to a guarded clinical coldness. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Garrison," he said, his voice dropping to a register that carried across the quiet floor. The transaction was not just declined. It's been flagged with a federal intercept code. Leonie's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. "Check it again," she hissed, her voice cracking. "My husband just secured a massive capital injection. Your machine is obviously broken." She grabbed her phone to call the bank, but her thumb froze on the screen. The device displayed a cold gray notification. Service suspended. Have you ever seen the face of a woman who realizes her last name has suddenly become a liability? It is a look of pure, unadulterated terror, masked by a failing facade of rage. Leonie stood in the center of the luxury mall, surrounded by the finery she could no longer claim, and realized she was a ghost in a garden of glass. I watched her flee toward the exit, leaving the watch behind. While she was being publicly dismantled, I turned my attention to the Lake Forest mansion. Pierce had just arrived home, his gait still carrying the swagger of the previous morning's raid. He reached the heavy iron gates, but they didn't swing open with their usual silent obedience. They were already open. The security detail I had once vetted nowhere to be found. He parked his car and sprinted toward the house, the silence of the estate feeling heavy. He burst into his private study and moved toward his trading terminal, his fingers dancing over the biometric scanner. Access denied. The words flashed in a sterile red font across the screen. 2 words that can turn a king into a beggar. Pierce didn't understand the geometry of the trap yet. He thought it was a technical glitch, a momentary hiccup in the system he believed he owned. "Biometric mismatch," I heard him shout through the hidden microphones. "I built this system." He frantically checked his physical mail, tearing open a heavy linen envelope that had been hand-delivered an hour prior. It was a formal notice of default from Silverback Acquisitions. His eyes scanned the document, locking onto the mention of Section 12C. The notice stated that because of a breach in trust status, the $125 million debt was now due in full, immediately in liquid cash. Silverback, he whispered, his voice trembling as he sank into his chair. Who the hell is Silverback, and why do they have my mortgage? He realized then that the house wasn't his. The cars weren't his. Even the chair he sat in was now an asset of a company he had never heard of, but which I had controlled for decades. He frantically dialed his CFO, then his personal lawyer, but each call was met with a generic automated voicemail. He was shouting into a void that I had created. He moved to the floor safe hidden beneath the mahogany boards, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The heavy door creaked open, revealing the only liquid assets he had left, $20,000 in physical cash. Every other penny, every offshore account, every corporate line of credit was frozen behind a wall of federal investigations and Vanguard liens. The mansion felt colder now, like a mausoleum for a dynasty that was still gasping for air. He looked out the window, his sweat-soaked silk collar clinging to his neck like a noose. They're not just suing me, he realized, the primal terror finally reaching his eyes. They're erasing me. He saw the dark SUV parked at the end of the driveway, a silent observer in the Chicago gray. He didn't know who was inside, but he knew they were watching him drown. Pierce realized in that moment that the Federal Intercept code Leonie had seen at the mall wasn't just a banking error. It meant that the IRS and the SEC had already been briefed. The sequential bills he had tossed in the snow, the pension fund siphoning the wire fraud, it was all being funneled into a federal docket by a whistleblower who knew every corner of his books. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the window, staring at the SUV. He looked like a trapped animal in a gilded cage that was rapidly shrinking. I watched him from my office in Manhattan 300 miles away, and for the first time, I felt the debt was finally beginning to be paid. Pierce stared at the dark SUV at the gates, his heart hammering against his ribs, and for the first time, he realized that in the world of high finance, a ghost doesn't haunt you, it buys you. I closed the laptop, the screen's light fading as the room went dark. Maria Gonzalez was about to return to the office with the keys to Pierce's offshore crimes, and the weekend had only just begun. I watched the heavy elevator doors slide open in my Manhattan penthouse, and for the first time in 6 months, I saw a face that didn't look at me with greed, but with the weary relief of a soldier coming home. Maria Gonzalez, a 45-year-old with sharp, observant eyes and the weary posture of someone who had spent 18 months carrying corporate secrets like a lead weight, sat at the edge of the velvet chair in the center of the room. She looked smaller than I remembered her rain-dampened wool coat, smelling of the New York storm she had just navigated to find me. Nathan Brooks stood by her side, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder, as he introduced her to the man the world thought was a fading memory. Maria looked at me, her eyes widening as she realized that the demented old man Pierce had mocked in company-wide emails was currently sitting in front of a command center that controlled half the logistics routes in the Midwest. I thought I was the only one who saw what he was doing to the driver's funds, she whispered, her voice trembling. I thought I was shouting into a void. I leaned forward, the soft hiss of the elevator doors still echoing in the quiet room. You weren't alone, Maria, I replied, my voice steady and wise. You were just the first one brave enough to say it out loud. Truth is like a leak in a dam. At first it's just a drip, but eventually it's a flood that takes the whole valley with it. Maria began to recount the systematic dismantling of Garrison Logistics from the inside. She revealed that Pierce hadn't just fired her for incompetence. He had attempted to blackmail her into silence. He threatened her elderly mother's health care benefits, telling her that one word about the pension fund discrepancies would result in a legal firestorm that would leave her family on the street. It was a staggering level of cruelty even for a son I thought I knew. Maria described how Pierce had forced her to authorize dozens of wire transfers under my forged digital signature while I was supposed to be in retirement. She had been the one to notice the Techmar Solutions shadow ledger, a black hole where $68 million of worker futures had disappeared. He told me the board approved it. She said, her eyes filling with a righteous indignation that matched my own. He told me you weren't well enough to understand the new direction of the company. I looked at the scrolling lines of code on the monitors behind her. He relied on the world believing I was a ghost, I said. But ghosts have very long memories, and they eventually come back to reclaim what is theirs. Click. That was the sound of the final lock turning. Maria reached into the inner lining of her coat and produced a small silver hardware token, a physical key that Pierce thought he had destroyed during her termination. She had managed to swap it for a dummy before the security team escorted her from the building. This token, when paired with the credentials Nathan had spent months intercepting, was the secondary authentication required to access the offshore Cayman accounts Pierce used as his personal clearinghouse. Nathan took the token with a grim smile, plugging it into the central terminal. The room was suddenly filled with the dry, sterile air of the server-cooled penthouse as the authentication sequence began. We watched in silence as the screens began to populate with thousands of lines of data. It was the final irrefutable evidence of wire fraud and money laundering. It wasn't just a ledger anymore. It was a map to my son's prison cell. We saw the direct links between the siphon pension funds and the luxury investments Pierce had made to keep Leonie's art gallery afloat during the market dip. Every dollar had a digital fingerprint, and every fingerprint pointed directly to the man who thought he had outsmarted the architect. Do you know what happens to a man who builds his house on a foundation of stolen dreams? He realizes he never really owned the roof over his head. As we dived deeper into the offshore accounts, the exit twist began to emerge from the digital fog. Nathan slowed the scroll, his brow furrowing as he isolated a specific series of outbound transfers from Pierce's private holdings. These weren't corporate expenses. These were massive secret siphons moving money into a private account, registered to a shell company in the British Virgin Islands. My heart, already hardened by Pierce's betrayal, felt a different kind of chill. The shell company was owned by Leonie Garrison. I stared at the numbers, millions of dollars that Leonie had been secretly siphoning away from my son, preparing her own escape pod even before the freeze hit. She wasn't just his partner in crime, she was his primary parasite. While he was selling his soul to impress her, she was already counting the silver and looking for the exit. It was a cannibalistic cycle of greed that made the air in the room feel even thinner. I sat back in my chair, the high-pitched chirp of the hardware token finishing its task, as the full credentials for the offshore accounts were finally displayed in glowing green text. Maria watched me, her relief palpable now that the burden of the truth had been shared. We had it all. Every date, every destination, and every forged signature. I looked at Nathan and then at Maria, seeing the faces of people who still believed in the value of the work we had done. This was the moment the civil debt call transformed into a federal execution. The trap I had built with Arlo was just the beginning. This evidence would be the killing blow. I stared at the secondary accounts Leonie had hidden from my son, and I realized Pierce wasn't just being hunted by me. He was being cannibalized by the woman he'd sold his soul to impress. He was alone in Lake Forest watching a dark SUV at his gate, completely unaware that his own house was being looted by the person sitting across from him at the dinner table. While we were drinking coffee and counting Pierce's sins in Manhattan, his own lawyer was starting to realize he'd hitched his wagon to a dead horse. The debt was ready for collection. The clock in Silas Reed's office ticked like a metronome for a funeral each second, pulling him deeper into a paper trail that shouldn't have existed. While I was in Manhattan sifting through the digital debris of Pierce's offshore accounts with Maria and Nathan, the Garrison family's lead counsel was beginning his own descent into the truth. Silas Reed, a man whose sharp features and expensive silk tie couldn't mask the exhaustion of a man who knew he was outmatched, sat hunched over his desk. The smell of stale coffee and expensive cigars clung to the heavy velvet curtains of his Chicago office. He was sifting through the Silverback Acquisitions loan documents, searching for a technicality to halt the total asset freeze that had paralyzed Pierce's life 48 hours prior. I watched him through the tracking pixel embedded in the digital subpoena my team had sent him. I knew exactly what he was looking at, and I knew exactly when he would find the ghost in the machine. He pulled a dusty manila folder from his archives, the original incorporation papers for Garrison Logistics from 1995, and placed them side by side with the new debt calling notice. Silas adjusted his glasses, the blue light of his monitor reflecting in the lenses like a cold fire. He leaned in, his breath catching, as he examined the signature of the Vanguard chairman. It wasn't just a similar style. It was the exact same biometric pressure point, he whispered to the empty room. My God, Pierce. Who did you actually borrow this money from? The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just looking at a corporate signature, he was looking at my hand unchanged after 30 years of building and dismantling. Silas discovered the hidden tracking pixel in that moment, a tiny line of code that flickered as he ran a diagnostic. He froze, realizing that I had been monitoring his screen in real time for the last 3 hours. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was a character in a play I was directing from 300 miles away. The mounting dread in his posture was palpable even through the digital feed. Click, the sound of a career ending, or a new one beginning in a prison cell. Silas used a digital overlay to compare the chairman's signature with my verified signature on a 1998 patent application. The match was 100%. The paralyzing clarity of the situation turned his skin to a sickly shade of gray. "Thane isn't the victim," he muttered, his voice trembling. "He's the predator." Silas looked at the forged confession Pierce had handed him on February 14th, the document admitting to industrial espionage that was supposed to be our winning card in his court. He realized he was holding a physical piece of evidence for a federal crime. If I present this confession in court, I'm not just a lawyer, I'm an accomplice to felony fraud and elder abuse. The cold clinical feel of the metal desk seemed to sap the heat from his body. He was a man who lived for the win, but he was smart enough to know when the board had been cleared. How much is a soul worth? When the bill is $125 million and your client is a delusional amateur, Silas didn't take long to do the math. He knew that if I was Vanguard, the case was already over. The freeze wasn't a mistake, it was a liquidation. He moved his shaking hands to his encrypted laptop and began a new document. He wasn't drafting a defense for Pierce, he was drafting a formal proffer of information to the Department of Justice. A garrison never stays loyal to a sinking ship. He thought, his survival instinct overriding 20 years of family loyalty. "So why should I?" He began typing, his fingers flying across the keys as he detailed every illegal offshore shell company Pierce and Leone had forced him to set up. He laid out the wire transfers, the tax evasion, and the systematic siphoning of the pension funds. He was turning the very weapons Pierce had given him against his own client to buy his way out of a federal indictment. Silas was a rat, and the ship wasn't just sinking. It was being towed into the abyss by a kraken named Thane. As he reached the end of his disclosure, he paused, a dark glint appearing in his eyes. He reached into his digital vault and pulled a file he had kept as a rainy day insurance policy. It was a secret recording he had made of Pierce in the back of a town car on Valentine's Day. In the audio, Pierce openly bragged about drugging my tea to get the confession signature, laughing about how I was too foggy to know what I was signing. Silas attached the file to the email, a final lethal nail in my son's coffin. He was no longer trying to save a legacy. He was trying to save his own skin by providing the Department of Justice with a roadmap to my son's incarceration. He knew that by the time the sun came up, the garrison name would be synonymous with one of the greatest falls in Chicago history. Silas Reed hovered his finger over the send button on the email addressed to the FBI field office in Chicago. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder, counting down the final seconds of his professional life. His sweat dripped onto the keyboard, a small, wet testament to the fear that had finally overtaken his ambition. He knew that once he clicked, there was no going back. The bridge would be burned, and the son I had once loved would be left standing in the flames alone. From my penthouse in Manhattan, I watched the cursor blink. I didn't feel a sense of joy, only a grim satisfaction that the architecture of justice was finally complete. Pierce Garrison didn't know his lawyer was currently drafting his eulogy. He was too busy checking his makeup for the morning news interview he thought would save his IPO. Silas took a ragged breath and pressed the key, sending the data into the void. Pierce Garrison looked into the television camera with a smile that had cost $40,000 in veneers, completely unaware that he was about to broadcast his own confession to the city of Chicago. My son didn't know his lawyer was currently drafting his eulogy. He was too busy checking his makeup for the morning news. I watched from my Manhattan penthouse, sitting in the blue-tinted silence of the Vanguard Command Center, feeling a cold, clinical disgust. The studio lights on the monitor were blindingly hot, casting a saintly glow over a man who had spent the last 18 months siphoning the futures of 800 families. Pierce was appearing on Chicago Morning Finance to perform damage control for the upcoming IPO, unaware that the host interviewing him was a former investigative journalist whose brother had been a veteran driver at Garrison Logistics. I had vetted her myself. She was a woman with a long memory and a sharp hunger for the truth. Pierce leaned into the lens, painting himself as the tragic, heroic son, forced to take the reins of an empire from a father who had lost his way. It's a heavy burden being the son of a pioneer whose mind is now a labyrinth he can no longer escape. He told the viewers, his voice dripping with practiced sincerity. "I'm here to protect our families from my father's unfortunate episodes. Lies sound better in 4K, but the truth looks sharper." I watched him explicitly state that I was impaired, suffering from advanced dementia and prone to erratic financial delusions. Every word was a gift to my legal team, a high-definition record of gaslighting and elder abuse that would be played back to him in a federal courtroom. I sipped my tea watching the scrolling tickers at the bottom of the screen. Pierce believed he was the face of the company now, the stable hand on the tiller. He didn't realize that by standing in that studio under those burning lights and the smell of heavy makeup and hairspray, he was actually standing on the trap door. The host baited him perfectly, asking soft questions that allowed his hubris to expand until it filled the frame. He spoke of my cognitive decline with such conviction that I almost felt a ghost of a heartbeat in my chest for the man he used to be. But that man was dead buried under layers of greed and silk. I closed my eyes for a second, recording the sound of his betrayal, ensuring I would never forget the tone of the voice that had tried to erase my life. 3 hours later, the scene shifted to the Lake Forest mansion. Pierce returned from the studio in a state of repulsive arrogance, celebrating his performance with Leonie in the library. I watched them through the hidden camera I had installed years ago as part of the security detail. They poured glasses of vintage Cristal, the golden bubbles rising in a mockery of a celebration. "Did you see the host's face?" Pierce laughed, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "They ate it up. I'm the face of the company now. The board won't even remember Thane's name by the time the IPO clears." Leonie leaned against the desk, her eyes bright with a predatory light. "Thane is a ghost, Pierce," she said, her voice like a razor hidden in velvet. "And ghosts don't have bank accounts." Pierce was building a throne out of matchsticks, and the air was already smelling of smoke. They discussed the freezing of the accounts as a minor glitch, a temporary technical hurdle they would fix once the IPO funds hit their secondary Cayman accounts. They were so blinded by the glare of their own success that they couldn't see the dark SUV still parked at the end of the driveway or the federal warrants being signed in a quiet office across town. Have you ever seen a man's face turn the color of wet ash in 3 seconds flat? It is a transition that no amount of studio makeup can hide. The quiet of the mansion study was interrupted by a chime at the front gate. A courier arrived with a small unmarked package. Pierce opened it with an impatient jerk of his thumb, expecting another legal threat or perhaps a desperate plea for money. Instead, he found a single black USB drive with a silver V. I seal the mark of the architect. He plugged it into his laptop, his breath hitching slightly as the high-pitched hum of the fan kicked in. I watched him from 300 miles away as a grainy video began to play. It was a hidden camera view from Valentine's Day, a night he thought I would never remember. The video showed the library we were currently watching, but in the past. It showed Pierce entering with a tray of tea, his hand steady as he dropped a clear liquid into my cup. It showed him guiding my hand to sign the confession while I was semi-conscious, my eyes vacant, my head lolling against the chair. Pierce stared at the screen, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. The metallic cold of the silver USB seal seemed to radiate through his hand and into his soul. On the screen, his own voice whispered, "Don't worry, Dad, you won't remember a thing." It was the definitive proof of a felony, a digital record of a son drugging his own father to steal an empire. But the video didn't stop there. As Pierce recoiled from the laptop, the camera panned slightly in the grainy playback. Leonie was in the background, her expression one of bored amusement. She stepped toward the desk, while I was slumped over and casually picked up my mother's heirloom watch, sliding it into her pocket with a practiced ease. She wasn't just a witness, she was a participant. Pierce looked at Leonie and then back at the screen, his breathing becoming ragged and uneven. He realized the ghost hadn't been hiding. The ghost had been recording his every sin, waiting for the moment his hubris was at its peak to pull the pin. Pierce stared at the screen as the video looped back to the beginning, and for the first time he realized that in the world of high finance, a ghost doesn't haunt you, it buys you. I watched him collapse into the leather chair, and I finally turned off the monitor. The hearing was tomorrow, and I was ready to collect the debt. The garage smelled of old oil and 30-year-old memories, a sanctuary of cold steel, where I had once taught Pierce how to build things instead of how to tear them down. While Pierce was drowning in the digital record of his own crimes at the mansion, I was sitting in a place that didn't know the meaning of the word greed. This wasn't the climate-controlled showroom of his Lake Forest estate. It was a safe house I'd maintained for decades in a working-class neighborhood on the south side. The concrete floor felt cold and gritty beneath my shoes, a grounding sensation that reminded me where Garrison Logistics had actually started. I sat in a worn lawn chair, the metal frame creaking as I leaned back. To the world, and certainly to my son, this place didn't exist. He thought I had spent my life chasing the same hollow luxury that now defined him. He never realized that I only built the mansion so he would have a place to sleep. I always preferred the silence of a workshop. I held a silver-framed photograph of my late wife Elena, the silver glimmering faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the high, barred windows. I recalled her final warning on her deathbed 18 months ago, her voice a fragile rasp that still carried the weight of a prophecy. "Pierce has your ambition," Thane she had whispered, "but he doesn't have your soul. Don't give him the keys until he learns the value of the lock." I realized now that my profound grief over her death was the very thing that had blinded me. I had been so broken that I had allowed him to seize control just to stop the noise. I thought love meant giving him everything he asked for. I didn't realize until it was almost too late that true love meant holding him accountable for the man he was becoming. "I'm sorry, Elena," I whispered to the empty garage. "I let him burn the house you helped me build because I was too busy mourning the architect." Memories are like rust. They don't look like much until you realize they've eaten through the foundation of your heart. I had allowed my nostalgia to protect a predator, and that realization was a bitter pill that I finally forced myself to swallow. I reached out and pulled a dusty ledger from a scarred wooden workbench. It wasn't a corporate document from Vanguard. It was a personal notebook where I had handwritten the names of my first 10 employees back in the 90s. I thought of the 800 families currently facing a frozen future because of my son's gambling. These weren't just entries on a spreadsheet. They were the souls I had promised to protect when I put my name on the building. I realized the impossible math of my situation. If I saved Pierce, I would destroy them. If I saved them, I would have to be the one to destroy my own son. The moral weight of the architect persona returned to me, then shifting my focus from personal revenge to a broader, heavier duty of protection. A leader doesn't protect his blood at the expense of his people. Pierce wasn't a victim of his mistakes. He was the designer of his own ruin. I had already made the most difficult move of the entire campaign. I had signed a document transferring 90% of my Vanguard wealth into a protected trust for those workers, ensuring they would be made whole regardless of the trial's outcome. Can you call yourself a father if you let your son remain a criminal just to keep your own conscience clean? I asked the shadows, but the only answer was the distant, muffled sound of a Chicago train rattling over the tracks. The answer was a cold, hard no. My loyalty to the legacy I had built with Elena outweighed my loyalty to a son who had drugged me and stolen from the men who made him rich. My phone buzzed on the workbench, the blue light illuminating the scratchy texture of the $300 suit hanging on a hook near the door. It was a final text from Nathan Brooks. "The FBI proffer from Silas Reed is in. He's ready to testify. All we need is your word." I stared at that cheap suit, the one Pierce had mocked in the courtroom, the one that represented the man I was before I had millions to lose. Tomorrow wasn't about proving I was wealthy. It was about proving I was right. Suit up, I told myself. It's time to finish this. "Give the word, Nathan." I typed back, my fingers steady. "The architect is finished. The liquidator takes the stand tomorrow." I felt a chilling determination settle into my bones, a complete absence of the doubt that had plagued me since Elena's funeral. It's time to show him that the value of a man isn't in his suit, but in his word. I stood up, the old lawn chair spring snapping back with a sharp metallic twang. I looked at the photograph of Elena one last time before tucking it into the inner pocket of the charcoal jacket. I was no longer the grieving widower or the discarded father. I was the supreme creditor, and the debt was about to be called in full. Click. The garage light went out, plunging the steel and oil into darkness. The mercy went with it. I stepped out into the night air, the Chicago wind beginning to howl through the alleyway like a choir of ghosts. I looked at my hands in the moonlight, the same hands that had built Garrison Logistics from a single truck, and the same hands that were about to dismantle my own son's life. And I didn't feel a single tremor of hesitation. The transition from father to hunter was absolute. Pierce had banked on my weakness, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had taught him how to calculate risk. He just never imagined that he would be the one on the losing side of the equation. I walked toward the rented sedan, parked in the shadows, my mind already in the courtroom, already hearing the silence that would fall when I finally spoke the truth. The morning air was as sharp as a razor, and I was the one holding the handle. The architect had finished the plans. The foundation was set. Now it was time to watch the building fall. The morning air was as sharp as a razor, and as I stepped out of the battered yellow taxi, I realized I was the only one in the entire plaza who knew I was the one holding the handle. I stood for a moment on the cold pavement, the smell of street vendor coffee and luxury car exhaust swirling around me. I smoothed the front of my $300 charcoal suit, the same suit Pierce had laughed at only 2 weeks ago. To the world passing by, I was just a tired pensioner, arriving for a difficult day in court. I watched from the shadows of a massive marble pillar as my son's world arrived with Hollywood-style flair. A motorcade of 4 black SUVs pulled up to the curb tires, screeching with a synchronized arrogance that demanded attention. Pierce Garrison stepped out first, followed by Leonie and then a small army of junior associates carrying leather briefcases that looked more expensive than their contents. Pierce paused on the steps, giving a practiced look of grieving concern for the swarming press. My father's health is our primary concern. Today he told the microphones, his voice carrying that rehearsed resonance I had come to loathe. But the integrity of the workers' future comes first, and we must secure the leadership of this company. Leonie leaned in her vintage Chanel, catching the morning light as she whispered loud enough for the nearest reporter to hear. "Look at him, Pierce. He actually took a taxi. It's almost poetic, really. Flash, flash, flash." The cameras were hungry, and Pierce was the meat. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. I waited until the swarm followed them inside before I began my own ascent. The entry twist lay waiting inside his briefcase. As we moved toward the security checkpoint, Pierce leaned toward me, his smile a jagged line of veneers. "I've hired a top-tier medical expert, Dad," he whispered, gesturing to a man in a clinical gray suit standing near the gallery entrance. "He's going to be observing every blink and every stutter. By noon, you won't even be allowed to sign for a pizza, let alone a corporate check. We're moving for immediate state-mandated commitment." I didn't respond. I simply kept my eyes on the cold glare of the marble walls. I saw Leonie check her makeup in a gold compact, her stolen watch, my wife's watch, shimmering on her wrist. She didn't look at me until she noticed my gaze fixed on her arm. "The watch looks better on a person who didn't have to steal it from a drugged man." "Leonie," I said, my voice low and steady. Her hand trembled for a split second before she snapped the compact shut and turned away. The hallway outside courtroom 4B felt like a narrow glass tube, and we were all just chemicals waiting for the reaction to turn explosive. We were forced into a communal waiting area, a space of forced proximity that Pierce used to pace like a predator in a cage. Silas Reed sat in the far corner, his face the color of wet ash as he stared at his own shoes, refusing to make eye contact with the client he had just betrayed to the FBI. Arlo arrived minutes later, moving through the crowd to stand firmly by my side. Her silence was a sharp weapon against Pierce's yapping arrogance. I leaned in and whispered into her ear loud enough for only her to hear the final piece of the plan. "Silas isn't just flipping Arlo. Vanguard has already instructed him to hand over the Valentine's Day tea leaves from the safe house as physical evidence of the poisoning." Her eyes widened, but she didn't say a word. She simply gripped my arm, her presence a bedrock of loyalty in a room full of shifting sands. Pierce continued to boast to his associates, discussing the details of the post-hearing celebration, as if the judge's signature was a mere formality. If you ever find yourself walking into the belly of the beast, make sure you're the one carrying the indigestion. I checked my watch, the humble, reliable one I had worn for 30 years. It was 8:58 a.m. I looked at Leonie, who was currently tapping her foot with an impatient rhythmic clicking on the tile. "Check your accounts one last time, Leonie," I said, the wise calm of the architect returning to my voice. "I want you to know exactly how much you're worth when you walk through those doors." She scoffed, rolling her eyes as she pulled out her phone. "I'm sure my private banker is much more reliable than your delusions, Thane." I watched her thumb dance across the screen, her expression one of bored contempt. Then the transformation began. The color drained from her face, leaving her a translucent shade of white. Her breath hitched a jagged sound that cut through the low hum of the hallway. "Pierce!" She stammered, her hand beginning to shake so violently the phone nearly slipped. "It's zero. Everything?" "The BVI accounts the gallery funds. It's all liquidated." Pierce tried to grab the phone, his face contorting into a mask of confused rage, but his own device began to chime with a series of frantic notifications. The heavy mechanical thud of the brass doors opening signaled the start of the final act. The bailiff stepped out, his voice echoing through the marble corridor. "Everyone rise for the Honorable Judge Davies." I straightened my $300 jacket, feeling the weight of Elena's photograph against my heart. I looked my son directly in the eye, seeing the first genuine flicker of ruin behind his veneers. He was a fisherman who had finally realized the whale was dragging him into the abyss. The high-pitched hum of 100 camera shutters filled the air as the press realized the power dynamic had shifted before we even entered the room. I didn't wait for Pierce to move. I stepped forward, my stride long and purposeful, walking through the doors first. The courtroom was a sanctuary of dark wood, an absolute judgment, a place where lies usually came to die. It was time for the architect to build his legacy, or for the liquidator to finish his work. The doors closed behind us, cutting off the noise of the plaza and leaving only the heavy silence of the end. I walked down the center aisle of courtroom 4B, the rhythmic click of my heels against the hardwood sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock that Pierce was too arrogant to hear. The courtroom was a sanctuary of dark wood and absolute judgment, a place where lies usually came to die, and the smell of floor wax and old law books hung heavy in the stagnant air. I took my seat at the defense table alone. I didn't bring a team of associates or a high-priced lead counsel. I only brought a single leather portfolio and the weight of 30 years of building what my son was currently trying to burn down. Pierce sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Silas Reed, and a phalanx of junior lawyers who looked like they were dressed for a victory parade. He didn't even look at me. He was too busy adjusting his silk tie and whispering to Leonie, who sat in the front row with a smug, predatory grin. She was wearing my wife's heirloom watch, a glint of stolen gold that served as a constant reminder of why I was here. I smoothed the front of my charcoal suit. Pierce had mocked it as a cheap $300 off-the-rack garment, but he lacked the eye to see the truth. It was a bespoke piece meticulously tailored to look ordinary, the final piece of psychological camouflage in a war he didn't know he was losing. Pierce stood before Judge Davies, exuding a performative grief that suggested he was doing the world a favor by suing his own father. He leaned into the podium, his voice carrying the rehearsed resonance of a hero in a Greek tragedy. "My father was a great man. Your Honor," he began, his eyes downcast for the benefit of the court reporter's rhythmic keys. "But he is now a danger to the very legacy he built. We have no choice but to protect the 800 families of Garrison Logistics from his erratic, mentally unstable decisions." He presented the forged Valentine's Day confession with a flourish, claiming my mental instability had led me to sell corporate secrets to our rivals. "We have the signed confession," he stated, his voice rising with unearned authority. "The theft is undeniable." Silas Reed stood beside him, stone-faced and sweating, his eyes darting toward the exit, as if he were measuring the distance to freedom. Bang! The gavel didn't fall yet, but in my mind the trap was already closed. I watched my son play his hand, realizing he had bet everything on a lie I had allowed him to tell. Judge Davies looked at me over the rim of her glasses, noting my lack of counsel and my seemingly humble appearance. "Mr. Garrison, you appear to be unrepresented," she said, her voice echoing in the cold, unforgiving glare of the overhead lights. "Do you understand the gravity of these charges? Do you have a response to this confession?" I stood up slowly. I didn't approach the podium. I remained at the table, projecting a quiet, lethal authority that silences the room more effectively than any gavel ever could. I addressed the bench not as a defendant, but as a peer. "I understand them perfectly." "Your Honor," I replied, my voice dry and resonant. "But I'm not here to answer for a crime. I'm not even here to defend myself against these fabrications. I am here as the supreme creditor." Pierce let out a short, sharp bark of laughter, a sound of pure derision that died instantly when he saw the look in the judge's eyes. Pierce was a child playing with matches in a room I'd soaked with gasoline, and he was just now starting to smell the fumes. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a sleek black tablet, submitting a digital motion directly to the court's secure terminal. I watched the monitors on the bench and the gallery flare to life. "Your Honor, the entity known as Silverback Acquisitions, which currently holds the primary mortgage on the Garrison estate and a $125 million lien against Garrison Logistics, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings." I paused, letting the name Vanguard ripple through the room like a cold front. "I am the sole chairman of Vanguard. I have been for 12 years. I submitted the documents Pierce had signed with Arlo only days prior, the Section 12C cross-collateralization clause. By signing these, the plaintiff has legally acknowledged First Vanguard's right to immediate asset seizure upon any change in trust status or corporate instability. Since the plaintiff has spent the last hour arguing that the company is in a state of crisis due to my supposed dementia, he has effectively triggered his own liquidation. Pierce's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray, as the debt collection motion was formally read into the record. "You borrowed $125 million from a ghost," Pierce, I said, looking him directly in the eye. "But ghosts eventually come to collect. Have you ever seen the exact moment a man realizes he doesn't own the chair he's sitting in? It is a spectacle of pure, unadulterated ruin." Pierce grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning a skeletal white, as he realized that I wasn't just the man he'd sued, I was the man who owned his very existence. "Your Honor," I continued, my voice cutting through the stunned silence of the gallery, "I move for the immediate liquidation of all Garrison Logistics assets and the seizure of all personal holdings associated with the plaintiff to satisfy the Vanguard debt." By submitting this motion, I had already triggered a secondary freeze on the personal trust accounts Pierce thought were safe from corporate seizure. He was now, for all intents and purposes, a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of legal debt. I sat back down, the leather of my chair creaking softly. The silence that followed my revelation was heavy enough to crush a man, but I was the one who knew how to breathe in it. Pierce stared at the dark screens of the courtroom monitors, and I knew what he was thinking. He was waiting for the next blow. He was right to wait. The courtroom monitors were about to play a video that would turn a civil case into a criminal execution. The silence that followed my revelation was heavy enough to crush a man, but I was the only one in the room who knew how to breathe in it. I stood before the bench, the cold, dry air of the Federal Circuit Court stinging my lungs as I prepared to deliver the final blow. I didn't need a lawyer to speak for me. The data spoke with a terrifying eloquence. I directed the court's attention to the massive monitors flanking the judge's bench. The high-pitched whine of the digital projectors signaled the start of the forensic execution. I displayed the audit Maria Gonzalez had meticulously preserved, tracing the $68 million as it pulsed out of the employee pension fund. The court watched in real time as the funds flowed into Techmar Solutions. Pierce tried to object, his voice a weak, high-pitched rasp that sounded like a dry leaf skittering across pavement, but Judge Davies ignored him. "He didn't just steal from a company. Your Honor," I said, my voice resonating through the chamber, "he stole the light at the end of the tunnel for 800 families. That Techmar address he thought was a blind trust I purchased that property in secret 20 years ago. He was funneling stolen futures into my own basement." The gallery, filled with union representatives who had caught wind of the hearing, began to murmur with a growing dangerous heat. Silence, not the quiet of a library, but the silence of a vacuum before it collapses. Pierce's fingernails scratched against the mahogany table, a desperate, frantic sound that set my teeth on edge. "That's distorted data," he finally managed to shout, though no one believed him. "He's hacking the system." I didn't blink. I simply tapped a command on my tablet. "Watch the screen." "Pierce," I said, my tone as cold as the ice on Lake Michigan, "it's the only time you'll ever see yourself in high definition again." The USB video from Valentine's Day began to play. The courtroom fell into a deathly chill as the reality of elder abuse and criminal coercion was broadcast for the record. We all watched as Pierce dropped a clear liquid into my tea, mocking my late mother's memory, while forcing my semi-conscious hand to sign the very confession he had tried to use today. I saw Judge Davis's jaw tighten into a line of stone, her eyes reflecting the flickering blue light of my son's crimes. Leonie tried to sneak out of the row, her face a mask of pale terror. But a bailiff stepped into her path, his hand resting on his belt in a silent signal that her time for running had ended. "How do you look at the man who gave you life and realize he's the one who just took it back?" Pierce looked at me then, and for the first time I saw no arrogance, only the hollow, shivering core of a man who had realized he was nothing without the name he tried to destroy. I can explain," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Leonie for a lifeline she no longer possessed. It was a medical necessity. I was protecting him from himself. I didn't look away. I wanted him to feel every second of the exposure. The smell of metallic ink and old paper seemed to intensify as the evidence piled up. The architect had built the trap, but the liquidator was currently operating the machinery, Every dollar Pierce had spent on Italian silk and offshore bets was being laid bare, each transaction a nail in the coffin of his freedom. I felt a profound sense of righteous indignation, not just for myself, but for the workers who had spent 30 years building the legacy he treated like a personal ATM. Reed was a rat leaving a ship that had already touched the bottom of the ocean. Silas Reed, seeing the inevitable firestorm, stood up slowly. He didn't look at Pierce. He didn't look at Leonie. He addressed the bench with the clinical detachment of a man performing a self-amputation. "Your Honor, I cannot in good conscience continue this representation," Silas announced, his voice carrying through the hushed room. "My former client has engaged in systemic federal fraud and has presented this court with forged evidence." Pierce's eyes went wide, his mouth hanging open in shock. "You coward!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "I paid you millions." Silas ignored him, producing a red manila folder from his briefcase, the FBI proffer I knew he had been holding. He handed it to the court clerk with a steady hand. "I am officially recusing myself and delivering this disclosure of information. It contains evidence that the family trust documents used to secure the Vanguard loan were notarized by a man who has been dead for 6 months. The entire loan application was a case of felony wire fraud." The lawyer handed the red folder to the judge and walked out without a single look back, leaving Pierce standing alone in the center of a burning empire. The high-pitched whine of the projectors faded into a heavy, expectant silence. I looked at Silas as he disappeared through the heavy brass doors, realizing that even the most expensive loyalty has a price when the FBI is in the room. Pierce was now truly unrepresented, a man without a shield in a room full of swords. Judge Davies began sifting through the red folder, the scratchy sound of the pages turning the only noise in the room. I sat back down, smoothing my suit jacket, feeling the photograph of Elena in my pocket. The circle was almost complete. The debt had been identified, the collateral seized, and the primary debtor exposed. The sound of heavy tactical boots on the hardwood was the last thing Pierce Garrison would ever hear as a free man. I watched the side doors of the courtroom open, and the glint of federal marshal badges caught the light. The architect's work was done. The liquidator's work was beginning. I looked at my son one last time, not with hate, but with the cold clarity of a man who had finally finished a difficult design. The foundation had been cleared of the rot, and for the first time in years, I could finally breathe. The sound of heavy tactical boots on the mahogany floor didn't just break the silence. It sounded like the final rhythmic thud of a funeral march for my son's freedom. I sat at the defense table, my hands folded on the leather portfolio, watching the gears of a system I had once feared now turning to grind my son into the dust of his own making. Judge Davies meticulously reviewed the evidence surrendered by Silas Reed, alongside the forensic audit I had provided. His face, already stern from years of presiding over Chicago's most complex frauds, settled into a mask of pure judicial fury. He looked at the data showing the systematic siphoning of $68 million from the men who drove the trucks and worked the docks. Then he looked at the grainy image of Pierce drugging my tea. He ignored Pierce's stammering pleas, pathetic high-pitched sounds that barely reached the bench. "Mr. Garrison, in 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a betrayal so calculated and so cruel." The judge said, his voice a low thunder. "This is a mistake." Pierce screamed, his veneers catching the clinical light. "My father is delusional. He's faking his recovery." He looked around the room for an ally, but he found only the cold, unblinking eyes of the law. I watched the judge's clerk hand him a document, and for a moment, the only sound was the frantic, high-pitched scratching of a pen on a warrant. The federal marshals weren't just waiting in the hall by chance. They had been briefed by Nathan Brooks 2 days ago. They were the silent partners in this design, waiting only for the lawyer's recusal to step into the well of the court. Judge Davies looked up his jaw, a line of unyielding stone. "The court finds the accusations against Thane Garrison to be fundamentally fraudulent," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The $7.5 million lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court upholds the motion for immediate asset seizure by Vanguard Holdings." He turned his gaze to my son, and the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Pierce Garrison, you are being held without bail on charges of pension, fraud, wire fraud, and felony elder abuse. Marshals take him into custody." 4 men in dark suits moved forward, their hands resting on their holsters with a practiced lethal calm. Click, clack. The handcuffs didn't just bind his wrists. They severed our bloodline. Pierce attempted to flee toward the gallery, a desperate animalistic instinct taking over. He didn't make it 3 steps. He was intercepted and slammed against the mahogany table, the same table where he had mocked my suit and my mind only hours ago. The sight of Pierce's face pressed against the dark wood, his silk tie askew, and his eyes wide with a primal terror should have given me joy. Instead, it felt like a heavy hollow weight in my chest. Justice isn't a warm blanket. It's a cold steel blade that doesn't care how much you cry as it cuts. I watched the marshals haul him upright, the metallic oily scent of the handcuffs reaching my nose. "Dad, tell them!" Pierce sobbed, his voice breaking as he looked at me. "Tell them it's just a business strategy. Please." I stood up slowly, straightening the jacket of the suit he thought was a sign of my decline. "I stopped being your father the moment you stole the bread from the workers' tables." "Pierce," I replied, my voice reflecting the absolute finality of the architect's final design. "You didn't just lose an empire today. You lost the man who built it for you." Leonie sat in the front row, watching in paralyzed terror, as the man she had propped up was reduced to a number in a federal system. She tried to stand, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a shield, but a marshal stepped into her path. "Mrs. Garrison, you are being detained as a material witness and potential co-conspirator regarding the siphoned accounts," he informed her, his voice devoid of emotion. Her phone, which she had been using to check her liquidated balances, fell from her trembling hand and shattered on the floor. I watched her be led toward a side exit, her stolen watch shimmering one last time before she disappeared into the shadows. Have you ever watched your own legacy walk out a back door in chains? It's quieter than you'd think. There are no trumpets, no grand speeches, just the rhythmic thud of boots and the closing of a heavy brass door. The courtroom was suddenly empty of the noise and the arrogance that had filled it since Valentine's Day. I was left standing in the well of the court with Arlo, who was crying silent tears for the brother she had lost long before the marshals arrived. I looked at my hands in the light of the courtroom, seeing the same lines that had drawn the first blueprints of Garrison Logistics. The architect had finished the project. The foundation had been cleared of the rot, but the building was gone. I felt the photograph of Elena in my inner pocket, a small comfort against the chilling determination that had carried me this far. I watched the steel cuffs click shut on my own flesh and blood, and for the first time in 30 years, the Garrison name meant nothing but a case number on a federal docket. I had won everything, and yet as I looked at the empty seat where my son had sat, I realized the cost of the collection. The debt was paid in full, but the currency was the life I had tried to build for him. Arlo gripped my arm, her presence a silent reminder that there was still work to be done for the 800 families waiting outside. I straightened my shoulders, the weight of the suit feeling lighter now that the truth was on the record. I didn't look back at the door where they had taken him. I looked toward the main entrance, toward the light of the Chicago morning. The sunlight on the courthouse steps would be cold and clean, like a fever had finally broken. The architect was finished. The liquidator was done. It was time to go home, even if the house was now empty. The sunlight on the courthouse steps felt cold and clean, like a fever had finally broken. But the swarm of reporters waiting at the bottom was a reminder that the world was still hungry for a Garrison's blood. I stood at the top of the marble landing, the sharp Chicago wind whipping my charcoal jacket, and watched the final stage of the collapse. Federal marshals emerged from the side exit, guiding Pierce toward a waiting transport van. The golden child of logistics, the man who had mocked my cognitive decline only days ago, was now hunched and shivering. He used his cuffed hands to shield his face from the staccato rhythm of the camera flashes, his $40,000 veneers hidden behind a mask of pure shame. Leonie was escorted out separately. Her emerald designer dress was wrinkled, and her pride had been vaporized during the interrogation that followed the hearing. I remained a silent figure of authority, above the chaos, refusing to move until the van doors slammed shut with a heavy clang. A reporter thrust a microphone toward me, shouting, "Mr. Garrison, did you orchestrate your son's arrest?" I looked directly into the lens. "I didn't orchestrate his arrest," I replied. "I simply stopped subsidizing his crimes." Flash. Flashes everywhere? A billionaire's funeral is always well lit, and today the world was burying the version of the Garrison name that Pierce had tried to build. I turned away from the media frenzy, my heels clicking on the stone, as I sought out the only person who still mattered. I found Arlo waiting at the base of a massive granite pillar, away from the prying eyes of the press. She looked exhausted, the warmth of her hand in the freezing wind the only thing keeping me grounded. I offered her a rare, sincere apology. "I'm sorry you had to be the Trojan horse, Arlo. I said, the weight of the deception pressing on my heart. I shouldn't have forced you to look your brother in the eye and lie. She squeezed my hand, her grip firm and forgiving. You didn't make me choose Dad, she replied. He did. I just chose the side that could still sleep at night. Arlo revealed that she had already coordinated with Nathan to ensure the workers' immediate needs were met, proving she was the true successor to my integrity. She was the only branch of the Garrison tree that hadn't rotted from the inside out. Even in her downfall, Leonie was still under my shadow. I had already purchased the debt on the $80 a night motel she checked into. I was technically her landlord now, a final piece of leverage in a game she thought she had won. 3 days later, the smell of disinfectant and stale sweat replaced the scent of floor wax and perfume. I sat in a sterile room at the federal holding facility, the cold feel of the prison visitation glass between me and my son. Pierce sat on the other side, looking disheveled and frantic. His silk shirt was stained, and the arrogant swagger had been replaced by a desperate energy. He didn't ask about Arlo. He didn't ask about the company. Instead, he spent the entire visit complaining about the unfair legal system and demanding that I use my vanguard influence to bribe a judge. You have the power, Dad. He hissed, his voice muffled by the glass. Call the U.S. attorney. Make this go away. I watched him, realizing that even in ruins, he refused to learn. I came here to see if my son was still in there. I told him, my voice reflecting a cold disconnection. I see only a stranger who is sorry he got caught. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with toxic spite. It doesn't matter, Thane, he spat. I was going to retire you anyway. I had the papers ready. I was going to put you in a managed care facility by the end of the month. You would have spent the rest of your life staring at a wall while I ran your empire. How many times can you break a father's heart before there's nothing left but the cold, hard stone of justice? Hearing him admit to the plan to lock me away was the final nail. It proved that my legal strike hadn't just been a retrieval of assets, it had been a necessary act of survival. Pierce wasn't a victim of a trap. He was a predator who had simply been out-hunted. I looked at him one last time, seeing not a son, but a liability that had finally been liquidated. He began to scream, then a high-pitched sound that echoed against the concrete walls of the visitation room. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply reached out and hung up the phone, cutting off the sound of his entitlement. I stood up and walked toward the heavy steel doors, the rhythmic thud of my own heart, the only sound I chose to listen to. Pierce's muffled screams continued to bounce off the glass, but they didn't reach me anymore. I had spent 30 years building a house for a man who only wanted to see it burn. Arlo was waiting for me in the parking lot, the heater in the sedan, humming a quiet tune of normalcy. I took a deep breath, the metallic smell of the jail fading as the crisp air filled my lungs. I felt the photograph of Elena in my inner pocket, her silent warning finally fulfilled. The debt was collected. The architect had finished the final blueprint, and though the foundation was scarred, it was finally clear of the rot. I looked at the gray Chicago sky, knowing that the most difficult part of the day was still ahead of me. The walk away from the jail felt longer than the mile-long driveway in Lake Forest, but my stride was sure. Some men don't want forgiveness. They only want a way out, and I had finally stopped trying to provide one. I hung up the phone and walked away from the glass, Pierce's muffled screams echoing against the concrete, knowing that the version of my son I loved had died a long time ago. I got into the car beside my daughter, ready to face the 800 families Pierce had robbed. The air at the logistics docks would smell of sea salt and hope, a stark contrast to the sterile misery of the holding cell I was leaving behind. The air at the logistics docks smelled of sea salt and diesel exhaust, but for the first time in 18 months, it didn't smell like a lie. I stood on a makeshift platform, constructed from heavy industrial pallets, looking out over a sea of 800 faces. These were the men and women who had carried the Garrison name on their backs while my son was busy trying to bury mine. The platform I was standing on had been built by the very first crew I ever hired back in the South Side, a quiet tribute to a connection that Pierce's greed could never fully sever. Nathan Brooks stood just behind me, holding a leather-bound ledger that contained the life's work of every person in the shipping yard. I looked at the weathered faces of drivers and the calloused hands of dock workers, and I felt a surge of restoration that no bank balance could match. My son thought your futures were a gambling fund, I told them, my voice carrying across the yard with the steady resonance of the architect. I'm here to tell you that they are the bedrock of this company. I'm not just giving you back your money, I'm giving you back your dignity. I reached for the pen Nathan offered and signed the transfer order that personally guaranteed the $68 million pension shortfall through Vanguard Holdings. 800 names, one pen, total justice. A roar of relief and gratitude erupted from the crowd, a sound so primal and honest it made the concrete beneath my feet vibrate. 6 days after the hearing, the scene shifted from the docks of the working class to the manicured lawns of the elite. I sat in the back of my Maybach, the engine a low hum of restrained power, watching as Vanguard operatives oversaw the systematic clearing of the Lake Forest mansion. It was a cold, clinical process. Movers in white uniforms hauled out $12 million worth of new money furniture, crystal chandeliers, and imported marble sculptures that had been purchased with stolen pension funds. The house was being hollowed out like a rotted tree, leaving only the memory of what it should have been. I watched a heavy metallic thud echo through the air as a foreclosure sign was hammered into the front lawn. The sharp stake pierced the ground on the exact spot where the snow had previously covered the $200 Pierce had thrown at my feet. The irony wasn't lost on me. That house was never a home, I remarked to Nathan as we watched a particularly gaudy gilded mirror being loaded onto a truck. It was just a monument to greed. Strip it to the floorboards, Nathan. I want every cent of the workers' money accounted for. Every gilded frame and silk rug would be liquidated to ensure the trust I built for the 800 was reinforced with the spoils of the man who tried to rob them. 8 days after the hearing, the Chicago streets were gray and unforgiving. I was traveling toward a meeting with Arlo when a figure stepped into the path of my car. My driver braked smoothly and I looked out the window to see a ghost. Pierce was out on medical bond, but the man standing there was a shadow of the golden child he had once been. His hair was matted, his skin a sallow gray, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate energy. He knocked on the reinforced glass, his knuckles making a hollow, pathetic sound against the luxury finish. "Dad, please!" I heard his muffled voice through the insulation. "I'm your son. You can't just leave me like this. I need a lawyer. I need a chance." I looked at him and for a moment I didn't see the criminal or the predator. I saw the child I had failed by giving him too much and demanding too little. But then I recalled that night in the blizzard. I recalled the $200 he threw in the snow while telling me to take the bus. Did he think $200 in the snow was a tip? No. It was the price he paid to lose his father. Have you ever watched your own legacy walk out a back door in chains? It is a sight that changes the way you see the sun. Pierce continued to beg his breath, fogging the glass, but I remained unmoved. As I reached for the control to raise the privacy shade, I noticed a final staggering detail. Pierce was wearing a charcoal suit that looked oddly familiar. It was the same cheap $300 suit I had worn to the courthouse, or a pathetic imitation of it. He was trying to mirror my humility, trying to dress in the skin of a victim to garner the sympathy he had never earned. The sight of him in that scratchy fabric mimicking the man he had tried to destroy solidified the ice in my veins. "You told me to take the bus, Pierce," I said, knowing he couldn't hear me through the glass. "I suggest you go find the stop." I pressed the button, and the cold, smooth glide of the automated privacy shade began its ascent. Pierce's face was slowly eclipsed by the black fabric, his screams for mercy disappearing into the pressurized silence of the rear cabin. The shade clicked into place, plunging the interior into a darkness that was finally peaceful. I didn't look at the rearview mirror as we pulled away. I didn't need to see him shrink into a tiny speck against the Chicago skyline. The debt was collected, the workers were whole, and the architect had finally cleared the site of the wreckage. I leaned back into the leather, feeling the photograph of Elena against my chest. And for the first time in years, the air around me felt pure. The privacy shade clicked into place, plunging the rear cabin into a silence that was finally peaceful. As the man who was once my son vanished into the Chicago gray, I closed my eyes, the weight of the suit no longer feeling like a burden, but like a promise kept. The letter arrived on a Tuesday 2 weeks after the world, as I knew it had ended. But for now, I simply enjoyed the silence of a house that was finally clean. Arlo's graduation gown was the color of a new dawn, and as I watched her take that stage, I realized that the true measure of a man's life isn't the buildings he leaves behind, but the character of the children who still look him in the eye. The letter from the federal holding facility had arrived on a Tuesday 2 weeks after the world, as I knew it had ended, but I had left it unopened on my mahogany desk. I needed this morning first. I needed to breathe in the smell of celebratory flowers and old books that filled the university hall. I sat in the fourth row, finally free from the weight of corporate camouflage, wearing a suit that was actually comfortable, because I no longer had to hide a recording device beneath the lapel. As Arlo's name was called for her pediatric fellowship, I felt a genuine sense of pride that nearly eclipsed the ghosts of the past 18 months. I looked around at the limestone walls and the stained glass of the hall, realizing that this very building had been funded by a secret donation I made 20 years ago in her name. I had never told her. I had never told anyone. It was the only part of my empire that hadn't been built to feed an ego or crush a rival. It was built to protect her future long before I knew how much protection she would actually need. After the ceremony, we walked through the quad, the warm golden glow of the afternoon sun reflecting off the windows of the library. Arlo walked beside me, her medical hood draped over her arm, her pace matching mine with a steady, quiet strength. "I'm ready to help you rebuild it the right way, Dad," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I've spoken with Nathan. I want to join the new garrison board. I can oversee the ethical compliance and the worker-first initiatives while I keep my practice at the clinic." I stopped walking and looked at her, seeing the soul that Elena had promised was still there. "You already have helped me, Arlo," I replied. "You were the only part of my legacy that didn't need a renovation. Rebuilding a life is like restoring an old ship. You have to scrape away the rot before you can see if the wood is still strong enough to sail." Looking at her, I knew the wood was stronger than the steel I had spent my life forging. We spent the afternoon discussing the transition of the company into a cooperative trust, a design that would ensure the 800 families were never again at the mercy of a single man's gambling debts. I returned to the Vanguard penthouse late that evening. The city lights of Chicago were flickering to life, but the office was silent, a vast cavern of shadows and unfinished business. I finally picked up the letter from Pierce. The envelope was crinkled, bearing the stamp of the Cook County Jail. I sat in my high-back chair and read it 3 times. It was filled with excuses. He claimed he only wanted to make me proud that he got lost in the numbers, that he was the victim of an aggressive prosecutor. He spoke of building a kingdom I would respect, but there wasn't a single word of apology for the pension funds or the drivers whose lives he had treated like poker chips. Whir. The rhythmic mechanical whir of the paper shredder filled the room. I didn't hesitate. Neither did I. I fed the pages into the machine, watching as his justifications turned into useless confetti. Love can't save those who refuse to be saved, and I finally accepted that the son I loved had died long before the handcuffs clicked shut. As the last of the paper disappeared, I noticed the ink on the signature. It was a specific shade of royal blue, the same ink from a fountain pen I had given him for his 10th birthday. It was the last remaining piece of the boy he used to be, now destroyed by his own hand. Arlo entered the office just as the shredder went silent. She didn't ask what was in the letter. She didn't have to. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and stood beside me. For the first time in years, Chicago didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like a city that was no longer my enemy. "Legacy isn't what you build," I told her, my voice reflective and calm. "It isn't blood or brick, Arlo. It's the responsibility we carry for those who trust us. Legacy isn't what you build. It's what survives." I had spent my life thinking I was the architect of a company, but I realized I was actually the architect of a debt that had finally been settled. Sometimes you have to burn the entire forest just to let the sunlight reach the floor again. Was it worth it? Yes. I looked at the desk one last time, my eyes lingering on the silver glint of Elena's photo frame. She was smiling, and for the first time since her funeral, I didn't feel the need to apologize to her. The debt was paid. The foundation was clear. I reached out and took Arlo's hand, feeling the firm, reassuring weight of her grip on my arm. "Ready to go to work, Arlo?" I asked. She nodded, a small, resolute smile playing on her lips. We turned toward the door, leaving the silent monitors and the empty leather chairs behind. I reached for the light switch at the entrance, pausing for a single heartbeat to look at the shadows one last time. I had been a ghost, a titan, and a liquidator. But as I stood there with my daughter, I was finally just a man. I flicked the switch, plunging the past into a darkness it had earned. We walked out and turned the lock on the post, the Chicago sun finally melting the last of the ice on the sidewalk. The end. I was the architect, but I failed first as a father. If my family story teaches anything, it's this: never ignore small betrayals until they become family betrayal. Pride builds silent disasters. I chose truth over blood, and I pray to God no one waits as long as I did. Learn early, protect what matters. Don't become another family story defined by regret or a warning of family betrayal. Some legacies survive, others collapse. Mine became both a family story and a lesson in family betrayal. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in Thane's position, forced to choose between justice and blood? I'd truly value your perspective. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Gentle note inspired by real-world themes, some elements are dramatized for storytelling. If this isn't your style, feel free to explore other content that suits you, Betty.